This is Jacob's Algebra, Chapter 12, Lesson 5, Part 2. We worked the first two problems from Set 2. Now we're going to work on the third problem from Set 2. This is number 6. Number 6 is just like number 11 that I assigned for homework. So the instructions for number 6 say, square each of the following expressions as indicated. So let's look at part A. In part A, we have the square root of 3 plus 5, and then the whole thing is squared. Well, anytime you square a square root, the square undoes the square root, so you end up with what you were taking the square root of. So we end up with 3 plus 5. Well, we can actually solve 3 plus 5. 3 plus 5 is 8, so 8 is our final answer. Let's look at part B. Part B is the square root of 3 times 5, and then the whole thing is squared. When you square a square root, you are undoing the square root, so you end up with what was inside of it. So we end up with 3 times 5, and we can actually calculate that. 3 times 5 is 15. Now let's look at part C. Part C is 3 square root 5 squared. Okay, this is where you have to be careful. When you have things that are being multiplied inside of parentheses and then the whole thing is being squared, each thing in the parentheses gets squared. This is 3 squared times the square root of 5 squared. 3 squared is 9. The square root of 5 squared is 5. 9 times 5 is 45. Every time what I see is this number, people forget to square the number that's outside of the square root. If it's outside of the square root, it gets squared. If it's inside the square root, it loses the square root and you get just the number that's inside. So 3 squared is our 9. Square root of 5 squared is our 5. 9 times 5 is 45. Now let's take a look at part E. Part E is 3 plus the square root of 5, and then the whole thing is squared. Do not just square your first term and your last term. Anytime you're squaring a binomial, there will be a middle term. Now, when we square our first term, 3 squared is 9. When we square our last term, square root of 5 squared, that's 5. Don't forget your middle term. Your middle term is the double of the product of the first term and the last term. So it's 2 times 3 square root 5. So we can add our number to our number. 9 plus 5 is 14. And then 2 times 3 is 6. And then times a square root 5. So we get 14 plus 6 root 5. Let's look at one more, part H. Part H says square root of 50 minus square root of 18, and we're going to square the whole thing. Okay, remember, we can't just square the first term and square the last term and say that's it. We square our first term, square root of 50 squared is 50. We square our last term, square root of 18 squared, that's 18. And then we're going to have a middle term. Now, our middle term is negative because anytime you're subtracting two terms and then you square it, the middle term will be negative. Your last term will always be positive. So this is negative of the double of the product of the first term and the last term. So looking at this, what is the square root of 50 times 18? Well, let's pull up a calculator and see. 50 times 18, whoops, that's 5 times 18. Let me fix that. 50 times 18, that is 900. So what we have here is 50 minus 2 times the square root of 900 plus 18. Now 900 can be broken down into 9 times 100. These are both square factors. So I'm going to say 50 plus 18, that's 68, minus 2 times square root of 9 is 3, square root of 100 is 50. I'm sorry, square root of 100 is 10, not 50. Sorry about that. Square root of 9 is 3, square root of 100 is 10. So 68 minus 2 times 3 times 10, that's 60. So we have 68 minus 60. And our answer for number 6, part H, is 8. Okay, let's move on to number 7. Number 7. Number 7 says multiply and simplify. Assume the variables represent positive numbers. So let's look at part B. What we have is 13 plus square root 12, and we are multiplying that by 13 minus square root 12. Notice we have the same two terms in each. We have a 13 at the beginning and we have a root 12 at the end. We're adding in the first parentheses. We're subtracting in the second parentheses. That's the pattern for a difference of two squares. What we're going to do is take our first term, which is 13, and square it. And then we're going to subtract our second term, which is square root of 12, and square it. 13 squared is 169. Square root of 12 squared is 12. So what we end up with is 157. So number 7, part B, is 157. Okay, let's look at part, where are we? 7, part D. Part D says, oh, I'm sorry, I miswrote part B. That's supposed to be 13 plus the square root of 2 times 13 minus the square root of 2. In this case, it's the same kind of problem. I just wrote a root 12 instead of a root 2. First term squared, that's 13 squared, minus square root of 2 squared. This is going to be 169 minus 2. And our answer is 167. I'm sorry, I copied down the problem incorrectly. It's supposed to be a square root of 2, not a square root of 12. That was just incorrect copying. Okay, so now let's look at number 7, part D. Number 7, part D, we have the square root of x minus 4 times the square root of x plus 4. Again, we have the same two terms in both parentheses, square root x and 4. We're subtracting in one parentheses, we're multiplying in the other. That means the pattern we're going to have is a difference of two squares. We're going to take our first term and square it, so that's square root of x squared minus our second term, and we square it. So the square root of x squared is just x, minus 4 squared is 16. X minus 16 is our answer. We're going to do one more, which is part F. Part F says the square root of xy plus 6 times the square root of xy minus 6. Now note again, this is square root 6 on both sides here. Now I want you to notice we start with square root xy in both parentheses. We end with square root 6 in both parentheses. We're taking the sum of these two terms here. We're taking the difference of these two terms there. That means we're going to end up with the difference of two squares. So we're going to have the square root of xy, and that whole thing is squared. We're going to subtract the square root of 6, and we're going to square it. The square root of xy squared is xy. The square root of 6 squared is just 6. So this is going to be xy minus 6. So this was number 7. It's just like number 12 that I assigned for homework. One last problem. Let's look at number 8. Number 8 says multiply and simplify. So let's look at part B. We have square root 8 minus 4 times square root 8 minus 3. Okay, there's several different ways we could look at this. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to multiply these out using a grid. So let me draw the grid and put in our crossing lines. Okay. So we have square root of 8 minus 4. So root 8 minus 4. Then we have root 8 minus 3. So root 8 minus 3. Square root 8 times square root 8 is 8, because anytime you multiply a square root by itself, you end up with the number that's inside the square root. Negative 3 times root 8 is negative 3 root 8. Negative 4 times root 8 is negative 4 root 8. And negative 4 times negative 3 is a positive 12. Okay, when we add this up, we have 8 plus 12, that's 20. Negative 4 root 8, negative 3 root 8, that is negative 7 root 8. Now, the next thing we do, anytime we have a square root in our answer, we look to see if it has any square factors. 8 has a square factor. 8 is 4 times 2. So we can take the square root of 4. We have 20 minus 7 times 2 root 2. When we take the 4 outside of the square root of 4 is 2. And then we still have a 2 that's left inside the square root. So this is going to be 20 minus 14 root 2. So that's one way to work number 8b. Another way that we can work it is to go ahead and simplify before we do anything else. We have root 8 here and here. We just simplified to find that root 8 is actually 2 root 2. So I can rewrite my problem as 2 root 2 minus 4 times 2 root 2 minus 3. So let me draw my new box and put in my grid lines. Okay, so I have 2 root 2 minus 4, 2 root 2 minus 3. 2 root 2 times 2 root 2. We multiply the numbers outside the square root. That's 2 times 2 is 4. Then we multiply the numbers inside the square root. Root 2 times root 2. That's root 4. Root 4 is, well, we'll just keep on multiplying at this point. 2 root 2 times negative 3. We multiply what's outside the parentheses. Negative 3 times 2 is negative 6. And then we have a root 2. Negative 4 times 2 root 2, we multiply what's outside square root. Negative 4 times 2 is negative 8, and then we still have a root 2. Negative 4 times negative 3 is a positive 12. Now, what is 4 root 4? Remember, the square root of 4 is 2, so this is the same as saying 4 times 2, and 4 times 2 is 8. So we can say 8 plus 12 is 20. And then we're going to subtract. We have a 6 root 2 and an 8 root 2. 6 root 2 and 8 root 2 is 14 root 2. So this is going to be 20 minus 14 root 2. Let's do one more problem from number 8. Let's look at number 8 part D. And that is 12 minus root 3 times 3 plus root 12. Again, I'm going to use grid to solve this. Put in my grid lines. Okay, on this left side, I'm going to write 12 minus root 3. Across the top, I'm going to have 3 and root 12. But look at 12. 12 can be written as 4 times 3. 4 is a square number. If we take the square root of 4, we get 2. And then we have a 3 left inside our parentheses. Whoops, I didn't want to take that part. I do want to take this part. Nope, not that. So I'm going to write 2 root 3 over here. 3 times 12 is 36. We multiply the numbers that are outside of square roots. 12 times 2 is 24, and then there's a root 3. Over here, we're going to have negative 3 root 3, because 3 is outside the square root, and the other 3 is inside the square root. We can't multiply them together. Outsides multiply by outsides, insides multiply by insides. And then we have negative root 3 times 2 root 3. That's going to be negative 2 root 9, which is negative 2 times 3, which is negative 6. So we end up with 36. And then 24 root 3 minus 3 root 3 is negative 21 root 3. And then we have a minus 6. This is 30 minus 21 root 3.